So thank you everyone for being here with us. We're really excited, and we hope that this is going to be an interesting panel for everyone, or directed discussion. So it is a directed discussion. So the way it's going to be structured is that Jeff's going to deliver a few slides about, and he'll probably go through them quickly. Then afterwards, we're going to open it up for people to comment and to have their questions or share their stories, their experiences. So if you've ever had an experience where, something went wrong or something was difficult, we can talk about it and figure out, okay, well, what are everyone's experience on that? How do they handle that situation? If there are success stories where, oh, we did this really cool thing and this is how we handled it, we use this license, or maybe modify the license, do you want to talk about that? That's great. And for those of you who just joined, you might want to grab the handout. And so, like I was saying, what we're going to do is we're going to do a few minutes of slides, and afterwards we're going to open it up, and everyone feel free to, provide your input. Let us know what questions you have, what success stories you have, what pain points you've experienced, because chances are there's someone in this room who's interested in what you've done. All right. So, Jeff. So,
thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
So, welcome. I'm Jeff Shapiro. I'm the Director of License Scanning for the Linux Foundation. Been with the Linux Foundation for a few years now. I've been doing stuff with open source licenses and compliance and auditing, et cetera, for a very long time. So it's something that that I'm experienced in, something that I enjoy sharing information about. Sometimes it's licenses, I'll just be honest, licenses can be boring. So I'll try and make this interesting and useful. So first of all, what is a license? Let's just be real clear and precise. A license defines rights and obligations. It gives you the right in the case of an open source license, it gives the user the right to specifically copy, modify, and redistribute source code. Those are all key provisions of an open source license. In yesterday's sessions, we heard a lot about, excuse me, I'm dealing with some allergies, so I apologize if my voice isn't great. We heard a lot about some different types of licenses. For example, the academic license is one that mentioned. So there's a lot of different types of licenses, and there are very specific criteria about what defines an open source license. There are lots of other licenses that are perfectly valid that give you the rights to view the source code, but it's not necessarily an open source license if you don't also have the right to modify and redistribute the source code. So if there are, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So rights. Open source means that you can use the code, you can inspect it, you can copy it, you can make modifications. Very important is creating derivative works. So you can use it as part of a larger application or system. Almost all licenses have some types of obligations and conditions as well. So these are some examples that are common. It's not exclusive. It's not comprehensive, but providing attribution is a very common obligation. You have to acknowledge that you're using the code. In some cases, some licenses will require that if you make changes and you distribute those, you have to contribute those back to the original project. Some license, in particular, we'll talk about this, what we call copyleft license. If you create a derivative work, you must release that under the same license as the original open source project. And most open source licenses also disclaim warranties or liability. So you can use the code, but if something goes wrong, excuse me, if there's a bug, we'll help you, but hopefully help you, but we're not responsible. This is not in my deck, but one of the things that is really wonderful about open source and the open source community, that with popular, widely used projects, it's pretty common that if bugs are found, then the community will fix those quickly. It's really an advantage of open source over closed source or proprietary code. If you buy a product and you're using it as part of a stack, and you've got bugs, and that product has bugs, that code base has bugs in it, you've got to go back to the vendor or the original author to fix the problem. And you're dependent on them to provide that solution or that bug fix. If you're using a popular open source project, and you find a bug or somebody else finds a bug for you because other people are using the code, you can fix it yourself, or you can wait for somebody else to fix it. And if it's a popular project, chances are it's going to be fixed pretty soon because you've got hundreds, thousands of other organizations, groups, people using the exact same code as you are. And if there's an issue found, chances are somebody's going to fix it pretty quick. Okay, license types. We divide open source licenses into two main classifications, what we call permissive and copyleft. So permissive licenses allow you to use the code in most situations with relatively few obligations. Again, one of the most common ones is the attribution. Copyleft licenses, and we'll give some examples of these in a minute. Copyleft licenses ensure one of the main things about copyleft licenses is that it ensures that the code will always remain open source. So we're here in an academic environment. There may not be very much commercial or proprietary software in the UC environment, but your teams, your groups, yourselves, you may be developing open source that you want to be compatible with, say, commercial or proprietary code bases, or you may not. But if you do, typically you'll consider a permissive license. Those are the ones that are more compatible with commercial or proprietary code bases. If you mix, which we'll talk about in a minute, if you mix code under a permissive license with proprietary code, then your open source in that context, in that combined work, is not necessarily available to other users. If you want it to always be available, you might choose a copyleft license. That ensures, and I know this sounds a little confusing, it'll make more sense in a minute. That ensures that the code will always be open source, and that derived or combined works, things that you mix that code with, will also be open source under that same license. So that's why copyleft licenses are typically less compatible with proprietary or commercial code. If you guys have questions about how that works and what that means, then we'll talk about it in the discussion. We can get into all those details. Copyleft licenses are further divided into two types, what we call strong copyleft and weak copyleft. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Another couple things when considering licenses. You may have heard of public domain. Public domain is not technically a license. Basically, in the case of public domain, the copyright is specifically, at least in the United States, this is different in other countries, but in the United States, public domain means that copyright is basically waived, or there's no longer a copyright that applies to that work. Proprietary, as I mentioned, is typically for commercial code, things that you want to keep as, often referred to as closed source. Although there are proprietary code bases where the source may be viewable. So the source, this is important. Source code being disclosed or being available or viewable does not automatically make it open source. You have to have the other rights that go along, as I mentioned earlier, for it to be truly open source. But just being able to see the source code, that doesn't make it open source. So how many licenses are there? There are a lot. These are some more common ones. UCSD, of course, which is originally from Cal. Most people have heard of Apache and MIT and the GPL style licenses. The GPL style licenses are the most common of what we refer to as the copyleft licenses. So here are some examples by name. So most common permissive licenses being BSD, MIT, Apache, and specifically in the UC community, BSD and MIT are the preferred licenses. Apache is not preferred by UC because of the patent clauses, as they talked about yesterday. Apache is extremely common, but there are reasons to consider whether you use it or not because of those the patent clause in that license. So the weak and strong copyleft, the GPL licenses are all part of the same family. This is for the GPL stands for New General Public License. Other common ones are the Eclipse Public License, the Mozilla Public License. A little less common and sometimes less understood or less familiar are the GPL licenses with exceptions. Anybody familiar with Java? When of course, Oracle owns Java because they bought Sun Microsystems a long time ago. When Sun Microsystems first developed Java, they wanted to pick a license for the JDK, the Java Developers Kit. And for people who programmed in Java, some of the main differences between GPL and LGPL are that L stands for, by the way, L used to stand for library, so it's the library GPL, and then they changed it, and L now stands for lesser, so it's called the lesser GPL. So as a copyleft license, what this means is if you have code that you release under the GPL open source license, and somebody uses that and mixes it with other code, they are required, by the terms of the license, they're required to release their code under GPL as well. So they're often referred to as viral licenses because, and I know this is not necessarily politically correct, but some people talk about code contamination. They talk about the fact that if you mix GPL with non-GPL, it copies over, it contaminates or transfers over to the other code when it's mixed together. And there are specific technical details about when that applies, and I won't go into that unless there are questions about it. We can talk about it in the discussion. The LGPL, one of the main differences is it gives an exception for dynamic linking. So if you're used to programming in, say, Visual C or C++, and you have, or using a Windows computer, and you have dynamic libraries, or Unix or Linux, if you have dynamic linking, the LGPL gives an exception so that the terms of the license don't copy or carry over for things that are dynamically linked, because there's that kind of separation. So when Sun developed Java, they wanted to give that similar type of exception, but they realized that Java doesn't strictly use dynamic linking. Java uses classes and this concept of class loading or class path. And so they developed, or they came up with their own license called the GPL with Java class path exception license. And it essentially means it's for technical reasons, the LGPL didn't quite fit. So they came up with their own license, and it's got an exception. Move along. Okay. This is an example of the MIT license. I'm not going to read this, but the reason I show this as an example is because as a permissive license, it really is pretty good at demonstrating what we mean with a permissive license. It says specifically, permission is granted to obtain a copy, to use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, sell, etc. So it's specifically granting you those rights. And then also it says software is provided as is without warranty. That's the disclaiming of the warranty. So I want to mention that a copyright and a license are not the same thing. It may sound pretty simple and straightforward, but just be sure that you don't confuse those. They went over this yesterday in yesterday's sessions about what a copyright is and what it applies to. Excuse me. And it's important to know that software is typically a creative work, although with AI and auto-generated code, that's now a little bit less clear. But copyright exists when you write something, when you create something. Copyright is there whether you specifically say it's copyrighted or not. It's a good idea to say it's copyrighted, but that copyright is there regardless. Copyright is owned by the author of the code, or in this case, or in some cases, organization, or it could be a company, or it could be, a UC campus or the UC Regents. So as was mentioned yesterday, when in the UC environment, when somebody writes code, then there are, a decision is made about who actually owns the copyright, whether it's the individual author or whether it's the UC Regents, for example. And by the way, if you can't find a license, if you have, people do this and they don't realize it is a mistake. People will post code online and they won't specifically declare what license applies to that code. If you can't find a license, if you don't know the license, just because the code is posted online, don't assume it's open source. And if you're posting code somewhere, please identify the license. Please specify what license you want to use. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. Actually, I'm going to gloss over this really quickly. A lot of projects, bigger projects, use something called a contributor license agreement. Essentially what this is when you have many contributors to a larger open source project, the CLA will allow contributions where people still maintain the copyright to the code that they are developing, but it allows the project to decide what open source license. So the author is basically giving responsibility or giving the rights to the maintainers or whoever's organizing or maintaining that project. It's giving them the ability to determine what license it's going to be used under. Another common thing in the Linux community is something called the DCO, the Developer Certificate of Origin. This is a little less heavyweight than the Contributor License Agreement, the CLA. This basically says, and this is actually what the Linux kernel uses, and many other projects that are hosted by the Linux Foundation. The DCO says that you're attesting, you're stating when you are contributing code to a project, you're confirming that you have the rights to contribute that code. Either you are the author or you have personal knowledge that you know where the code comes from, that it's under an acceptable license, and you can contribute that to the project. So these are typically for bigger open source projects where you may have lots of contributors. Who here has heard of SPDX? Okay, just a couple people, not many. SPDX is a standard. It was developed by the Linux Foundation. It stands for, it used to stand for Software Package Data Exchange. Now it's System Package Data Exchange. It is becoming a very widely used and accepted standard in the software community. Who here is familiar with an SBOM, Software Bill of Materials? Same couple of people. Okay, that's fine. Becoming more and more important when we use open source and just in general to know what the provenance or pedigree is of the software that we use. Most large-scale applications today are built on top of open source. Most code is reused. Most large applications now contain 70, 80, 90% open source, and then just that layer on top, maybe 20% that is really new code, it's original code. That's a good thing. That means software reuse. That's a good thing, right? It means we're not wasting our time rewriting all those things that are already there. It really lets you focus on the stuff that is specific to your application, specific to your purpose. So I think it's a really good thing that, many years ago, everybody used to write all their own code. Today, you can create a very complex, sophisticated app or system, and 80 or 90% of that code is reused, and you're not writing it yourself. That in my book, that's a really good thing. So, and that's why we're here, right? And you guys want to write open source. You want to contribute to that community, so that's good. So, software bill of materials, or SBOMs, which is not the topic for today, are a way to understand all of the pieces that go into that application, into that system. So they're very important. And if you have questions on it, we can get into that. But SPDX is a way that you can define a software bill of materials. But there is one particular thing. The reason I'm talking about all of this in licensing is because the SPDX standard has something called the license identifier, the SPDX license identifier. One of the things about open source licenses is when you write open source yourselves, or if you use open source, as I said, you need to know what the license is, or you need to, if it's your code, you want to define the license, you want to declare what license you're using. And if it's somebody else's code, you want to know what license it's under. How can we be sure which license it's under? Well, typically, like any piece of software, you add a comment, right? You have a comment somewhere in the header of the file. The thing about comments is that how many people here write code at some point in time? Okay, most of you, good. So no matter what language, excuse me, no matter what language you're using, it's good to document your code. It's good to add comments so that you can remember what this was for. You can remember why you wrote this code. Other people can use it and see, what its purpose is and how to use that code. So if you have a license, the obvious thing to do is to put a comment at the top of the file saying this code is under the BSD license. That's great, except it's not so great. Because how many people here are familiar with the BSD license? Not many. That's okay. So again, BSD is an open source license that goes back many, many, many years. It stands for Berkeley Software Distribution. So it came out of UC. But there isn't just one BSD license. There are dozens of BSD licenses, and there are dozens of variations. There is the BSD 0 license. There is the BSD 2 clause license. There is the BSD 3 clause license. There's the BSD 4 clause license. Okay, am I boring you yet? And each one of those has different variations as well. So there are probably, I don't know, a dozen, maybe a couple dozen different variations of the BSD license. So if you put a comment at the top of your file saying this open source is under the BSD license, it's completely ambiguous as to which version or which type of BSD license you're using. So these license identifiers are really important because they're unique, they're human readable, they're machine readable. You can use software composition analysis tools and other scanning tools to be very precise and by using this identifier and specify exactly which license you're using. So there's no ambiguity, there's no question, there's no confusion. So those are really important. Okay. So license obligations, I'll just go through this really quick. The obligations that you have depend on, are you distributing the code? Are you combining it? Are you making modifications? License conflicts. I'm not going to explain this in detail. Just know that many open source licenses are compatible, but not all of them. Many open source licenses don't play well with each other. So if you're building a stack and you're using open source from lots of different places and it's under different licenses, that's where that bill of materials comes into play. You need to understand what licenses you have and whether those licenses conflict with each other. Also, when you're mixing open source with proprietary or closed source, that has implications. Here's a good example that sort of shows how this works. So if we've got a permissive license like BSD or MIT, and you're mixing it with proprietary code versus the weak copyleft like the lesser GPL, strong copyleft like the GPL. This is what happens when you mix it. And by mixing here, let's say, for example, that I'm actually compiling everything into one binary. If you mix it with proprietary code, effectively everything's proprietary because the permissive license essentially lets you relicense. You're not relicensing the original open source. You're not changing the license here, but the combined work can be released under a proprietary license. The weak copyleft, you have dynamic linking. So you have your library that stays under that copyleft license and your code stays proprietary. If you have the strong copyleft license and you mix it, what you end up with is everything is being released as open source. So you're required to license your work under this existing or this license that this code is under. Let's see, I'm going to skip this. If you are making contributions, you want to consider the way that you're contributing that. Choosing a project license, you have to consider a number of things. You have to consider what your goals are for your project, for your code. In the case of the UC community, you're also considering perhaps what the preferred licenses are, or how that's going to be released and combined with other things. So just a couple tips on why you choose a permissive license versus a copyleft license. So yeah, that's a lot of the basics for licenses. This is something I created pretty recently. This is what I call best practices for licenses. So this is sort of this is meant to be a real brief, concise overview. These are laminated for a reason. Hopefully they'll last a long time. You'll keep them. So with that, let's open up to discussion and questions.
So I'm wondering, for the folks here who've written code, how many of you chose your own licenses, and what factors? Okay, what factors were you looking at? Were you considering, who you wanted to make it available, how widely you want to make it available?
Well, so this was originally an academic project at UC Berkeley. So we wanted to make it available for anybody to use, including commercial applications. So we didn't want to use a copyleft license. we chose the BSD 3 clause license. I don't remember exactly why. I don't think we had strong reasons to prefer that over some of the other similar ones. It was reasonable. I think the three clause part was just the extra bit, if I recall, was basically saying people couldn't use the name of the project without asking us. So we wanted to do that. But we didn't, I don't think we had strong considerations one way or the other. I think we just, other projects out of UC Berkeley, as you said, it was kind of a commonly used license, BSD type license. So that's what we went with.
And that's, I mean, everything you said is reasonable and valid, and especially in the UC community, if you have no strong reasons to use something different, that's an excellent choice, and it's an extremely common license. I didn't stress this earlier, but I want to mention it now. When you're choosing an open source license, you can choose, you know, if you're the author, if you own the copyright, you can choose whatever license you want. I strongly recommend that you choose a well-known license. There are many, many hundreds of licenses out there. If you want your code, if you want people to use your code, which is generally why we're making it open source, choose a well-known license, because then people are going to recognize it, they're going to understand it. They're going to say, oh yeah, that's under BSD 3 clause. I know what that is, and it makes it easy for me to use that open source. So I'm not going to be worried about it. If you use an unusual license, people are going to say, I don't know exactly what this means, because most of us aren't lawyers. Most of us don't know these things inside and out, and they're going to be concerned about using it. Or they're going to say, I don't care what the license is, I just want to use the code. But then if they're in an organization, their legal department is going to say, we don't know what this license is, don't use it. And that's not good either. So yeah, unless there's a really, really good reason not to, choose a well-known license, and it'll make everybody's life easier.
So one of the things that's interesting about academia, right, is that, you know, you can have different hats. Like you could be a student, and you could be working in your capacity as a student. You could be, you know, a student, but you could also be being on a research project. Or you could be a student and you might be working with a staff. And each of those cases, you might want to think about, you know, if I want to release code, how do I do it? How do I do it? Or who do I need to talk to when I release code? Because when you're doing it on your own, university, you know, you're your own actor. You're an independent actor, not necessarily you're not necessarily having to follow all the university rules. But if you're doing it as a staff member, if you're doing it as a researcher, then, and especially as a researcher, you might have funding, or there might be development agreements in place that might dictate what kind of licenses you have. Yesterday, we had a gentleman talk about how, you know, he wants, like their funders are asking for OSI approved licenses. So OSI, you know, you can go on the internet, look up, go to the URL and look at what kind of licenses those are, what they find acceptable as open source. And, you know, like Jeff was mentioning, there are open source like licenses. So they're like licenses, they're like open source, but they're not quite. There's the ones that have that little twist, like the MSPL, Microsoft Public License, where they say you can only, you have all these rights, but only when you're doing it for the Microsoft platform, right? Because they're trying to build that ecosystem. So they want to get your contributions. They want to get you to do the work, you know, do these things, make their stuff more valuable. But they only want it from Microsoft. And, you know, they are a big platform. So, you know, you kind of have to follow the rules. Or you might have something where, you know, you want it just for academia. You know, you're like, you know, these people like, I don't know, maybe Microsoft, we'll use Microsoft, we'll pick on them today. We'll say, oh, Microsoft, they're only letting me use it on their platform. Well, I'll show them, I'm going to make it so that they can never use my software. And one way to do it is like the GPL, right? It's like, oh, they're not going to want GPL because then they're going to have to make Microsoft Windows available on the GPL. But another way to do it is, I still want people to use my stuff. I want other researchers to use it. I want to help my community. So you can always do like the academic license. add condition that says you can only use this for non-commercial. You can only use this for research. You can only, and the thing with, I've been an attorney and I've been in-house, and I always kind of get a little bit wiggy on some of the things with, like, when it says only it's non-commercial use. It's like, well, what does that really mean? So, if you want to throw a little monkey wrench to, to the lawyers and people in industry, you can do that. Like, my other favorite one is like the good or evil, right? You can only use my source code for good things. And people will have different opinions on what that is. Like, right? Do I really want, I don't know, someone using it to scrape all my data and sell my information to other people? I personally consider that not so good, but other people might think it's a great thing because maybe it gives them a chance to get more research or understanding. And but has anyone had any problems or like had any issues with their open source? Or, you go to your attorneys or you go to your release engineers and they come to you and say, oh, there's a problem. Has anyone had that experience? I've had one. I can tell you a story about it if you want. Yep. Okay, go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, as I mentioned yesterday, we have to clear titles because we would rather not put the university at risk, like we won't do a deal. And this was very clear cut because, and this was a long time ago when we did the IP due diligence at the end of the process. So I think we were basically ready to sign and license with an entity that wanted this. And then we discovered that one of the copyleft, aka sticky or viral libraries was used. And we, thankfully the one that was used is only triggered when you distribute. So we were able to work around that, but we were sweating for a while. So it's important to understand what you're obligating yourself to when you use a particular license.
That's a great point too, because a lot of people will tell you that, a lot of the copyleft are triggered by distribution. And that's true. But you've got to also be careful because sometimes a license will define what a distribution is, right? And so sometimes a distribution could be, hey, I'm hosting it on my website. I'm not really distributing it. No one's downloading it, but they're using it. And that could still trigger the copyleft requirement. That's the Affero, right? It's basically what it does. Yeah. So if you're like thinking, I'm going to develop this great new company and we're going to be doing service, like we're going to be providing services, you don't want Affero. And the rumor is like, at Google, Affero is completely banned. You don't ever bring it in the house. And if you do, you're going to get in trouble. Kind of. Well, maybe not.
I'm sure that's more. I'm sure that's not a rumor. I'm sure it's just true.
Okay. But yeah.
So what Karla is referring to is there's a variation of the GPL, the GNU General Public License, which is one of the main types. The GPL, as we said, is one of the most common copyleft or viral licenses. Excuse me. And as Karla said, most of those obligations or the copyleft provision, it's triggered on distribution. Typically, and there are different ways, like most legal matters, some things are open to interpretation and precedence, but commonly distribution means you're giving that software to someone outside your organization. So if you're a commercial entity and you give it to a coworker, that's not considered a distribution generally. If you are in the UC environment and you were, say, giving it to somebody else in the same campus, maybe that would not be. So when software as a service and network applications started to become more prevalent, and web applications, these licenses all of a sudden started to not make as much sense anymore because people release code under GPL because they want anybody else who uses that and creates this combined work or derivative work, they want it to extend to those new things. They want that license to carry over. So people started using GPL on a web server and mixing it with things on a server and saying, well, look, I'm not distributing it because it's sitting on my server. other people can hit my server, other people can use my website, use my web application, but I'm not distributing it. So I can still mix it with whatever I want, and I don't have to worry about these copyleft provisions. So somebody said, oh, I don't like that. That's not good. So they came up with this new license called the Affero GPL or AGPL, and it specifically has language in the license that says if you are running my code under the AGPL license, if you're using it on a server or on a network, then everything doesn't matter if people are downloading it. It doesn't matter if people are if you're sending it somewhere. It's just sitting on your server or on your network. Then all the other software that it is combined with on the same network, on the same server or series of servers on the same network, these copyleft or viral conditions of the license, they will apply to everything on your network, everything on your server, everything on your network, everything that's connected, even if it's not being downloaded or distributed. These copyleft and viral provisions apply to everything on your network. Well, if that's what you want, that's great. But companies like Google are like going, oh crap, excuse my language. They're thinking, we use this AGPL code on our server, and now those copyleft provisions apply to everything. You imagine how large is Google's network? How many servers do they have? How many virtual servers do they have? I can't count that high. So you can imagine how big of a problem that is. So so that's why people are very, very cautious about using that Affero GPL. I wanted to mention a couple of things really quickly, based on what Karla just said a minute ago. By the way, on your little quick reference card, there are some websites here that are useful. For SPDX, there's a lot there. Two things in particular. The SPDX website has something called a license list. So it's just a list. It's a quick reference for literally hundreds of licenses, open source licenses. The open source initiative, that's a commonly accepted opensource.org. That's a neutral body that is commonly acknowledged for several things. One is they have something called the open source definition. So they publish on their website what the commonly accepted definition of open source. They also publish a list of what they call OSI approved licenses. Now, to be really clear about something, if an open source license does not need to be OSI approved, and if it's not on that OSI approved list, doesn't mean it's not an open source license. There are lots of open source licenses that are not OSI approved. So, and there are a lot of common and very widely used open source licenses that are not on this OSI approved list. That's okay. Also, I wanted to mention, so I've got this box up here called .open source. So there's in particular this top one called source available. Well, if the license has a restriction or a limitation, then technically it's not open source. But that's okay, because, for example, they introduced yesterday, or they talked about yesterday, the academic license. What's the actual name of it? The academic license. The academic license, which is I guess developed by UC. If your intention is to share your code with other researchers and other people in the UC community, but you don't want it to be used for commercial purposes, that's totally okay. That's great. If that's what you want, that's just fine. Use the academic license. But remember that the academic license is not an open source license because it has that restriction or limitation. So don't call it open source. That's fine. That is technically what we call a source available license, because you can do many of the things you can do with open source, but it has, excuse me, it has that specific restriction or limitation about not allowed to use for commercial purposes. So it's non-commercial. If it's truly open source, it cannot have that limitation or that restriction. So if your intention is to make it available, but not available for commercial use specifically, that's just fine. Use the academic license or another license of your choice, and that would be source available.
One of the things, I'm gonna, I've been in industry and I've seen a lot of different things. So I want to just give you a couple of gotchas. You probably already know this if you're programmers, but a lot of times you might be using tool chains. You might be using like the GCC. You might be using something that will, another piece of code, MATLAB would be another example, where they will insert code into your product, right? Into your final product. And so it's really important, and we call these things dependencies, right? Your code is dependent on that. It's really important that when you're building, that you understand what dependencies are going into your product, what you're going to be distributing. Because if you don't, if you're not careful, and it's a gotcha because you're not thinking about it because you're not consciously making those choices, right? You could find out that you have GPL in your code, and maybe that's not what you want. Or, you want to be careful that, if it's a LGPL, that you are making sure that you're complying whatever with their exceptions. Yes, Virginia.
This is really interesting to me because I didn't know this. So say if I use Python and I use a package manager and it creates like my highproject.toml file, these kind of, basic files that just describe what's in the project. Like, would that trigger like a license issue? Like, am I distributing their code because they spat out an automated file?
It could potentially be, part of that. I would look, at the license to see, hey, is there something in there that's saying like, this isn't, covered, or look at the FAQs. That's another great place to go because people will have questions about it. And, one of the last things I'm going to warn you about too is that different actors have different, when they look at a license, they want to interpret it to their own benefit. So I've seen people look at the Apache and they look at the grant and they'll say, oh, that grant applies to everything and it applies to the future, right? But then you go to the, look at their website, the FAQ, like any future versions, right? So like when you're looking at patents, you want to make sure that, it kind of restricts I'm trying to do this quickly, and we're almost out of time. But
actually, Karla, if I could answer her question specifically, if that's okay, thanks. So you made a really good point, something we haven't really talked about, and that's the difference between source code and dependencies. Everything starts from source code somewhere, but we write our applications with our own source code in Python, and Python has a package manager. And it has dependencies, and it pulls these Python packages from all sorts of places or from different locations out on the internet. And every single one of those packages that it pulls in also has a license. So you've got the license, and you have no control over that. I mean, you have some control over which hopefully complete control over the dependencies you're pulling in. But there are direct dependencies and transitive dependencies. Direct dependency is something that you say, I need this to use to run my application. And a transitive dependency is a second or third or et cetera level dependency where something you use has a dependency on something else and pulls that in. Every single one of those packages has an open source license. And so your entire system, you've got the license for your own code that you declare, that you decide. And then all those packages also have licenses. And we don't have time to go into that completely, but those have an impact. And yes, if you create a wheel file and you're distributing it to someone and you're building your software and all those packages get pulled in and then then yes, you are distributing those dependencies, those packages under other licenses, and you have to take that into consideration. So absolutely, that's a big part of what we call software composition analysis for creating the software bill of materials, is understanding what you have in your own code, in your GitHub repos, and all these other packages that you pull in that you're dependent on. It absolutely matters, yeah.
And so, thanks, Jeff. And just to get back to what I was saying earlier, it's just I want you to know that if you are contributing a project and has a patent grant, you've got to be really careful about like what is that scope of that patent grant? Are you only doing contributing, your essential patents for that version that you contributed to, or are they going to try to, or is it ambiguous? And there might be someone out there who's going to try to say, well, this applies to all, like if to all versions, later versions that you didn't contribute to. So maybe they add a new feature, and that feature was something that you wanted to commercialize. So you want to be really careful about, what is the scope of that patent grant, because it could trip you up later on. Like with code, what you're giving. With patents, you might not know. And that's why it's important if you're working for a university, for a company, that you talk to your legal, and they'll help you determine, does this license make sense, right? It's part of why Apache isn't favored at the UC, is because we know there's a patent grant and we don't want to accidentally give away something that was important to someone else, in the university system who is working on something similar. So, yeah, sorry we didn't have more time, but I hope this was helpful. So thank you, Jeff.